Welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast.
The podcast for rehab clinicians that want to better serve older adults.
And now, your host, Dustin Jones.
Hello, friends. I hope this episode finds you doing well. Thank you for the download. Today on the show, we have Cindy Kraft. She is the president of Cornetti and Krafft Healthcare Solutions, former home health care section president of the American Physical Therapy Association. She has over 20 years of home health expertise and just a wealth of information. She works alongside Dee Cornetti, which is a previous Senior Rehab podcast guest. And they are both hilarious, and I really enjoy talking with them, but I really, really enjoy their perspective. They've taught me a ton about just the setting of home health and all the good, the bad, and the ugly that comes with it. And they've been very encouraging to me in how to be a better therapist and how to document more efficiently and, just to improve my quality of care. So I really appreciate them, and I'm excited for you to meet Cindy. She... like I said, it's over 20 years of experience, but has, spent a ton of time as a clinician, educating other people as well, and really being a voice for our profession. If any home health therapists are listening to this, if you recall the days of the 13th and 19th visit reassessments, you can thank Cindy for getting that change, as well as many others that were involved with that. But I know Cindy was a big part. And we'll talk about that situation a little more in depth. So this conversation was broken up into two parts. This is part one with Cindy Kraft. Look for part two next week. So let's get into this with Cindy Kraft, physical therapist and president of Cornetti and Krafft Healthcare Solutions. Cindy Kraft, welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast. I appreciate you getting up early this morning and talking with me.
I'm glad to be here.
I am excited to talk with you. Our friend Dee Cornetti, got this thing together and kind of pressured you into talking with me. So I'm very thankful for her. But I also wanted to thank you because if I understand correctly, you were pretty influential in getting the timing regulations changed in terms of the functional reassessments in home health. Is that correct?
Yeah. I mean, nobody ever makes that kind of stuff happen by themselves, but I basically bugged the heck out of Medicare with all sorts of questions and laying out possible responses to show why this really was not working. Yeah. And why it really wasn't fair.
Yeah. I thank you so much because I started, when I started home health, that the 13th and 19th visit reassessments just made my life miserable. And it took me a long time to really get my timing down. As soon as I felt like I was getting the grasp of it, they changed it to 30 days, which I was very thankful for. So
I'm thankful you stuck it out in home care.
Yeah.
Because for that to happen at the start would be like, drop the mic and I'm done. I'm not messing with this stuff.
Yeah, it was not looking good for sure. So, but I would love to hear just kind of, your career in terms of where you started and just kind of your journey up to what you're doing now.
Well, it's been an interesting path. I would say I made the decision about being a PT quite young, 13, 14 years old. And ironically, I was thinking about this yesterday in anticipation of this call. I'm probably one of the smaller group of individuals that really didn't find out that physical therapy was a sustainable job choice till the first week I was in PT school.
Really?
I know. I had gone through all the rigmarole, especially at that time, extremely competitive. I thought I was going to have to give a kidney to get in at one point.
Yeah.
But then they had us that very first week and we're explaining some of the job projections. And I remember leaving and going back to the dorm and calling my dad and saying, I'm not going to have to live with you. This could actually turn out to be something that I don't have to, live off other people for the rest of my life to try to do it. And my vision at that time was I wanted to work in a big rehab facility. My passion had always been about traumatic brain injury.
Okay. Why is that?
I guess, being very candid about it, I always found the difficult patient, the psychiatric related patient, the TBI type issues, they're difficult people, but there's a reason. There's a medical or chemical thing going on. I have a much harder time with people that are just kind of rude or obnoxious because they choose to be.
That's a very good point.
So I very much I had done a 6-week rotation as a student.
Okay.
And yeah, there's a lot of interesting stories that came out of those 6 weeks, but I really felt that was a population that maybe wasn't getting a fair shake necessarily in relation to the longer term management. The acute phase, yes, but the longer term chronic issues of keeping them, as mobile and functional as possible really intrigued me. The irony is we sit here many years later, and I have never worked in a large rehab facility with traumatic brain injury.
Yeah.
I kind of stuck my toe in the pond and somewhat unwillingly into home health. And as of this month, I will be celebrating my 21st year in home health.
Wow. Tell me about that unwilling step into home health. What was that situation like?
Well, always the good planner. I had opted to get married still in physical therapy school. And a year later had our first child 1 month after graduation.
Oh, that's very wise.
Well, yes, because it really puts you in a good job situation at the very beginning. And so, I really felt, oh my gosh, I put all this work into it and I really want to take care of my family responsibilities. And I also want to use this skill set I've developed. And so through a lot of, kind of weekends, evenings, job shifting around between my husband and I, a good friend of mine and a former classmate said, well, I'm doing some home health. You want to try it? And I'm thinking, really? Because I err on the introverted side. Really? And going out into the house was like, really? I don't think I could do that. Yeah. And she's like, no, you could try it. And I had really, gotten frustrated trying to make hours work and take care of my son. So I said, okay, fine. I'll try some of this and see what would happen. And I can still in my head see my first home health patient, because what resonated to me is this is so functional, so practical, so real. And looking at it in retrospect, I don't think I could go back to facility-based care. No offense to anyone who does it. Yeah. I've been doing some skilled nursing facility periodically. And I know I could not go back to that for more than the occasional help situation. If anything else, I think I'm in there telling them why they need home care and they should go home. But it's just something that really resonated to me from a very practical patient standpoint. And, once you've done that, for me, going back to the simulated home environment just wasn't going to cut it.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that from the clinical standpoint and then also the lifestyle standpoint. I mean, you mentioned the lifestyle really drew you to home health. And, that was my main reasoning, the first job I took. But just from the clinical perspective and just lifestyle, it would be difficult to go back to a facility or even an outpatient clinic and kind of work the 9 to 5. Not to say it's bad. I know a lot of people that listen are in that situation. But yeah, I would agree with you. It'd be tough to go back.
But I also think it's tough for people to step out of that into home health because there's sometimes a lot of misconception. Yeah. And I think sometimes I've told Dee, I think we're our own worst enemy at times. When we get together, we love to share war stories. I saw a cockroach. I saw a cockroach as big as his head. I think that cockroach could have helped with transfers. And so we get all that out of our system. But my husband, who's not in healthcare, he always says, I don't like sitting with too many of you because these stories get really uncomfortable. And I think, if we're sitting with other therapists who have never done home care and they hear this, or a few years back in one of the therapy publications, they had an article about home health, and I got really excited until I opened it up and the therapist was discussing her near carjacking experience.
Oh my gosh.
And it's like, okay, that's the stuff that sets a tone that says, I'm not going to do it. Because apparently we're, secretly crime fighters and dealing with pest control and all kinds of negatives. And that we encounter things along those lines, but not with the degree that, because if it really was as frequent as some of our stories allude to, we should all get a mental health screen as to why we work in mental health, because that would be ridiculous.
Yeah, that is a good point. That reminds me of my My wife is a ER physician, and it's very annoying when they all get together because they talk about what objects get stuck in what orifices in people's bodies and all these crazy stories. You're like, what? Why? Why would you want to do this?
Right.
But I can see it. So I mean, you said that kind of misconception. That was a big thing for me coming into home health, was just, what kind of settings would I be going into? And, I foresaw every single person, had cockroaches and rats and just disgusting living spaces, which was not the case at all. And then I also had misconceptions about documentation as well, because I heard, it was an absolute nightmare. Home health, you're going to slave away all the hours of your day, filling out notes and OASIS started cares and evals and whatnot. Are there from your perspective, are there other misconceptions that kind of grind your gears in terms of home health that keep people from coming into this setting?
Well, it's one of the on the top of my list is actually not what keeps them from it. It's sometimes what draws them to it. I fully appreciate, for my own reasons, and like you just voiced, the flexibility piece can be a huge lifestyle positive, but at times it becomes, how little do I have to work? Or I hear a lot of, I would do home health, like, when I need extra money for a vacation, or kind of that PRN thing. And then, especially in my current role, I interact with agencies who, have 10 therapists on paper, but have maybe one FTE's worth if you squished it all together.
Wow.
And I think that makes it very difficult in terms of building programs, of really developing clinical depth in that group, to really look at how we're managing these patients and how aggressive we can and should be with this population. And it can drift into kind of like, well, I'll just do a few visits and then I'll be done for the day and I'll just do whatever else I need to do. And I think there's that fine line between the work-life balance and it's more about life and not so much about work when you're supposed to be doing the work.
Yeah. What do you say to employers that are in that situation? What can they do from their end to really promote, employees really buying in and dedicating themselves to their work? I know there's only so much you can do, but I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
But if you think about how a lot of home health positions are advertised or promoted, they promote basically two things more often than not, flexibility and pay. Yeah. And so what I talk to home health agencies about is that if that's your two biggest carrots, that's the kind of rabbit you're going to get. You really need to be looking at that one-on-one patient care. I mean, what other setting can you spend 45 minutes to an hour and a half plus on an admin with just you and one patient? Yeah. I mean, that's unheard of anywhere else. And a lot of people don't know that about home health. I mean, it can be intimidating. I know I was initially to think, what am I going to do for 45 minutes by myself? And then it's like, oh my gosh, the 45 minutes is over. I got to get this.
Right.
But, I think that the promotion of that individual patient care, the functionality, that's a piece where I really try to work with agencies that they need to make sure that is part of the conversation from the get-go and not just, here's top dollar for minimal amount of commitment, because that might be all you're going to attract with that model.
Yeah. I'm guilty of being attracted by those two things.
Well, no, but I mean, there's a piece of that. Yeah. But when that becomes the only conversation, it's really hard then to say, and I challenge leadership with this a lot. Yeah. Someone says they're only going to work 2 days a week. You agree to this, and then you're mad at them that they won't work the third day. If you really need more than that, that expectation needs to be set from the beginning, because it's kind of unreasonable to go into this arrangement with the therapist and then be mad that they don't suddenly want to work twice as much as they said they would.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. So let's dive back into your career. So you were, doing home health for a while, and then tell us kind of the transition from there into your current role with Korneti and Krafft Healthcare Solutions.
Well, that path was, starting on doing the visits, really liking that piece. And then our organization was going through some transition, as organizations are prone to do, looking at different, partnerships and acquisition kind of thing. And I really started to say, wait a minute, I don't seem to understand these rules very well.
Yeah.
I will say that, my orientation to home health, unfortunately, is not uncommon to this day. It was basically, here's the patient's address, here's an eval form, come back when you're done.
Yep.
Because they're desperate.
Yeah.
And so discussion about homebound status and those kinds of things really didn't happen in a formal way. They kind of through trial and error and picking up bits and pieces. And I really started to get frustrated and say, there's got to be rules for this kind of stuff, right? Like a place you can go read them instead of hearing them hit and miss. Or my personal favorite is, hear one person say, no, this is the rule. And the other person says, no, that's the rule. And it's like, okay, you can't both be right. So where do we go for this? And so I started digging in on the regulatory side to really better understand what the expectations were. And what surprised me is they were not impossible to read. I wouldn't say that they're, super sexy and woohoo, everybody wants to take them and read them on the beach. But I found that, if you read them, you don't necessarily have to like them, but you start to better understand what's expected of you. And that some of the stuff you're told is, oh, Medicare doesn't like X, Y, or Z, isn't really in there. There's a lot of room in those regulations when they refer to therapy services with words like complex and sophisticated, not gate training to the mailbox. You realize that there's a lot of freedom in that. And you need to know what your boundaries are. And so it kind of set me on a path of, before you tell me I have to do something, can I please see the resource? And then to try to share that with coworkers and say, listen, we have to know what these expectations really are. And that kind of got into the whole, at the time I came into home health, it was still essentially, pay per visit for all the services. PPS hadn't started yet. And it was like, so why are we keeping people for 3 years? I mean, this doesn't make any sense. And what are we trying to accomplish? So I guess it kind of got my regulatory juices flowing in relation to really wanting to understand that. And that kind of morphed it into, I don't think enough of our peers read this stuff. They rely on interpretation or, somebody's comment about it. And so I really felt passionate to say, we need to talk about utilization of therapies, but we got to really understand some of those contextual issues. So I started, I live in Illinois, so I had done a submission to Illinois Home Care Council. And I remember my husband went with me that day for my very first presentation. And I said, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to throw up. That's it. I'm staying in the car. They have other sessions are going on. No one will notice. And I can't do this. I've changed my mind. And he's like, you really can't. I said, oh, whatever. Okay. And that really snowballed quickly to more requests to present, more requests to do that kind of thing. And then it wasn't sustainable to have a day job and try to do that. So, that course of continuing to build that kind of activity. And then Dee and I had crossed paths numerous times prior to it, but it was a conversation that said, basically, why not? Why can't we do this together? And that started because it'll be our 3rd anniversary in June 1st. And it's really just been interesting. I know that for some therapists, the idea of not being, elbow deep in direct patient care every day somehow makes you less of a therapist. But if we don't have advocates that spend that kind of time with regulatory bodies, the stuff that people don't necessarily want to do, but if we don't have that level of advocacy, our profession suffers. And we don't get to do what we know patients need. Like you mentioned at the beginning with the 1319, when that had nothing to do with patient need or anything else. That was strictly numbers of visits that affected payment. And so, digging in on issues like that, I see it as, not only educating, but working to protect our role in this particular setting.
Yeah. So I'm interested to hear just from the educator standpoint, you all are traveling all over the place talking to therapists and home healthcare companies. Other than what you've already mentioned, what are some of the surprises that you've had along this journey in taking more of a educator role?
Well, the thing is, Dustin, for me, it's been about 10 years, not necessarily as many surprises.
Yeah.
It has been very interesting in joining forces with Dee to see what surprises her that used to surprise me. Oh, yeah, wait a minute. You haven't seen that before. Okay, let's talk about this because this is not the one and only place this is going to happen. I think when you mentioned the documentation concerns, again, not necessarily another sexy topic, but something that has to be dealt with. And to sit in a room full of trained therapists, many of them seasoned even more than I am, and to hear someone say out loud in a room full of people, I just do what the box tells me.
Wow.
You really... My concern is I try very hard not to get jaded. So interacting with folks like you, going to things like CSM and reminding yourself that, I'm not crazy is kind of what I have to do because many of the rank and file I run into are very passive in this. I just make the visit. I just put what the EMR asked me for. I give very minimal exercise programs. I don't really challenge I think it's a degree of apathy that really frustrates me. That you say this isn't. I really couldn't call it bad care.
Yeah.
But it very much feels like subpar. Like you kind of lost your spark for. What could you really do for these people? And not just kind of, it's one more rule, it's one more thing, it's one more form, and I'm just basically in survival mode.
Yeah. So what's the solution for that? Because I know you're tackling that from what you're doing now, and we've got we're more active on social media, it seems, in terms of home health therapists, and I'm trying to do a little bit with this podcast, but what other things could we do? Because I even feel the pull towards laziness and apathy because, for me, I came from an outpatient ortho clinic surrounded by therapists, weekly meetings, journal clubs, you had a lot of accountability, and if you screwed up or did something stupid, someone was going to call you out. And it's so easy to hide in home health. It's easy to be lazy. I don't want to be lazy, but some days if I'm, really fatigued, have a lot of patience, it is just, it's very conducive to doing as little as possible. So what should we do about that? What do you think?
Well, I think part of it is attracting more, I can't think of the right word at the moment. We need to get more therapists into this setting that own their skill. And what I mean by that is two things always stick out in my head back in my career span when I was in a position of hiring therapists. One physical therapist said, well, I would like to do home health, but I'd have to give up my skills. And I'm thinking, no matter what the job market is, I use that with students now and say, no matter what the job market is, that's something you don't say in an interview. I really don't care because you just blew it. So I it was over at that point, but I had to ask anyway, what are your magical skills you're giving up? And it was, I specialize in the treatment of incontinence and lymphedema. And I'm thinking, yeah, that's good because we don't have either one of those in home health. Yeah. And then the other therapist, was kind of looking at home care, and he looked at me and said, but home health is a place where old therapists go to die.
Wow.
And you look at that and you say, but again, if this has really been more convenience than clinical, I think we have a base of people that can lean that direction. But I think that, getting energetic people involved, when you talked about things like journal club and that kind of stuff, the challenge in home health is that kind of therapist to therapist interaction. And let's be honest, just therapist to nurse. Was my nurse here today? What's her name? I don't know what her name is. Can you just
I've never met her.
And I love when they tell me, well, she's shorter than you. Well, I'm 6'2". They're all shorter than me. That didn't help. So please stop. But, it requires an intentionality that says we are going to meet every couple of weeks. No, we are. Yeah. And this is what we're going to do. And I think by getting people into those groups and say, even if it starts with just two of us bouncing those kinds of ideas, is it, a handful of people on social media? I think it's going to take that kind of, kick in the proverbial pants to get people unstuck from that. But I think part of the issue is the documentation. And that is one of my passion areas from an education standpoint, because I think our relationship with documentation is extremely dysfunctional in all settings. And I think it starts in therapy school, quite frankly, because they're trying to teach us how to document when we really don't know anything. Let's be honest. We didn't know anything. But we aren't stupid. So what we figured is in those little case studies in those classes is you basically needed to give the instructor back what they expected to see. And also, not being stupid, we realized fairly quickly that the instructors weren't consistent. One wanted more of this and the other one liked it more of that. Well, this one in the neuro class is going to want more neuro sound and stuff, and the other one's going to. So we started giving them that stuff back. But then if you think about our first clinical, especially that very first one, we were like, oh, I don't know much of anything. So we tried to absorb that, and here comes the documentation. So we wrote our first few notes. And I remember going into subsequent clinicals feeling like, well, I at least had done something with a real patient. But then you watched your documentation get tore up one way or the other. It was either you wrote too much or you wrote too little. I remember the instructor I had who said, why do you write all that stuff? Nobody's going to read it. So you go back and forth. And I think what happens as a student is we develop a conditioned response that says, what do I have to write to humor you? It's an external issue. And so then it gets translated to you have to write to get paid. You have to write for the third party payer. So it always feels like something intrusive and extra that I want nothing to do with, but I have to do to humor somebody else. And I'm not sure what the magic bullet cure is from the student perspective, because we don't have the clinical depth. But a lot of times I'm telling clinicians now, basically get over it. Documentation is an extension of your clinical skill. Okay. So the issue is if you write stuff like I'm reading, this is why people want to hand off our services to less costly providers. And why your advocacy now of you're so important to be part of this benefit really falls on deaf ears when it appears that your favorite thing to do is walk people to the mailbox. And as I love to point out, it always says to, it never says from. So they're just being deposited into the mailbox or to the kitchen or to the bathroom. And I said, this is just basic English, and you're not even paying attention to that. So I tell, nurses, I said, if you're ever out your day and you see an older person kind of wandering around their mailbox, they've probably had a home health PT visit. And someone needs to pull the car over and direct him back in, because we're capable of going unidirectional on this one. But that's what I try to point out is I think a lot of it is the frustration with the documentation, I have to fill these things in. And so we either are writing more than we need to that isn't adding value. We're not really focused and we don't own it. And I think that adds to the stress of I have to fill out more notes because if I don't write this down, I don't get paid. But then you look at it and you say, but that's really the kind of therapist you want to be? Really? Because this looks like you don't do much of anything other than take people for walks. I mean, it's like a professional people walker. You don't have time to walk your old person. I'll send a PT out and they'll take them for a walk. I mean, we do more than that. And I think that's kind of the rub in home health is the frustration with the documentation bleeds over into how much do I really have to do? And briefly, one of the other things I think it is in any setting, we spend the majority of our time with people that have impairments or they wouldn't be getting therapy. And I think what can happen is we start comparing them to each other as opposed to true normal. And that can also lead to the apathy of it's one of the same 3 home programs I use on all my patients. Does it really need to be more than this? Because look at them. They're all kind of, aged and frail. And that one person where you go, wow, that guy looks so much better than the last 3 I've seen. Well, I think we run into that risk in any setting of comparing different levels of impairments to each other as opposed to true normal, true independent is not, he got it on the 3rd attempt. That's not how this works.
That's such a good point. That makes me think of an interview I did with Ashton Applewhite. She wrote this book called This Chair Rocks. And we talked about ageism in our culture, but then in rehab as well. And I remember talking about how our perceptions are so influenced because all we work with are sick people. And, for me, I'm not close to my family in terms of geographical location. So the opportunity to spend time with healthy older adults is pretty limited. And so my perception of normal aging has been very skewed to what, people can actually do or what they, should be doing, at a certain age and given, their history and whatnot. But yeah, that's a very good point, because that will definitely influence, the level of intensity, the level of, resistance training that we're going to do. And yeah, it just really impacts everything. That's a really good point.
But I do have an example for you of how far off the rails it can go.
Yeah.
I've read literally thousands of home health therapy notes, more than I ever thought I would. And when you say what surprises you, you think you've seen just about everything that could possibly be wonky in there.
Yeah.
Until I came across a group of therapists who apparently used such similar, their standard 2 or 3 exercise programs, that as opposed to documenting the exercise program, they actually named them after themselves. So it would be like reading the note and you're putting down Dustin number 1 will progress to Dustin number 2 in 3 weeks. And I'm reading this going, what? That can't be right.
And they didn't fill in the information of what Dustin number 1 is.
No. It was, and each one had their own. So they named it. So then, you'd see some where I guess Cindy number 1 would eventually go to Dustin 2.5. I don't know. It was all by name. And so asked to see, can I just see these programs? I mean, is there maybe there's a whole bunch of them. Maybe they're really specific. And what showed up was a scan of the proverbial home health program.
Yeah.
The drawings of the people, like 10 or 12 on a page, which is really good when they have visual issues, clearly photocopied into infinity because it's crooked and messed up. And you go, oh my, okay, this is what I suspected, but this is the first time I've ever seen systematic, I'll just name the few protocols I've used in my head after myself.
I wonder if they did CrossFit. CrossFitters they have some named workouts named after different people. They don't typically name them after themselves, but it's kind of standard across the group. But that's funny. Dustin number 1, number 2.
But can you see where now you're going to have Medicare look at this and say, well, should I pay for this therapy? Well, they did it Dustin number 1. Okay, there you go.
Boy.
You got it. That's I can tell you. Well, and my challenge to them is, so let's say you and I showed up at their agency and said, we can take your visits today. What am I going to do with Dustin number 1? I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
It's like those pieces. And it just speaks to how do I make this documentation, work for me, as opposed to why were you there? Why do we keep documenting, the patient's doing these exercises, whatever that might be, twice a day with the daughter and walks, every day with the ALF staff.
Yeah.
And my visit is, let's do the exercises again and walk some more.
Right.
It's like we do this to ourselves, as opposed to saying there's things that, especially as people are getting better, that the things they do when we're not there, why are we spending visit time having them do it again?
Yeah.
I mean, our reason to be there is to contribute that skill, and skill is not in what the tasks we use. I use this analogy quite a bit in documentation training, but I think it fits this morning because I can't believe it's early April and I woke up with my grass all frozen. That, picture for a moment that you've come into a tremendous amount of money, whatever amount of money makes you happy. And one of the first things you would do with this is quit. And many clinicians will make a face at me and I'm like, no, you will. You've rehearsed it, especially in home health. You've rehearsed it on some days in your car, who you would tell, what you would say. I mean, you've got it all planned out.
Yep.
So you do this. You're done. You need a break. So you're not currently employed as a physical therapist. And now you take some of that money and you go buy yourself an island. And you know what? You've had it with the people and the rules and everything else. So you want an island that's uninhabited. So you go out to your island. It's just you. And you're currently not employed as a therapist. Nobody else is there with you. In that moment, are you still a physical therapist? And people look at me funny, and I'm like, that's the skill.
Yeah.
The skill is what you know, what you possess, what goes into the home with you and leaves when you leave. It's not that piece of paper. It's not the task you give them. It's the knowledge behind it that's the skill.
Yeah.
And so we get very task oriented, I think, in the planning piece and definitely in the documentation, that then raises the question, why did it take a physical therapist? And we say, well, because I use the fancy therapy words. Well, But the skill is in your decision making. Do you take credit for your professional opinion about what you're doing and why you're doing it? And I think that's what not only undermines our documentation, but is part of the apathy, that I'm just doing these things because they need to get done, and not acknowledging the tremendous amount of skill behind, making the choice of what should be done on this visit, and the ability to come into that home and go, yeah, plans changed. Crazy daughter's in town. We're not doing this. We're switching it right now.
Right.
I'm not messing with that.
Yeah.
But, that piece, we do a lot of it between our ears and don't really own it.
Yeah. And what you just said, I think, that applies to us as home health PTs, but also, many, many other settings, all of them, I would say for sure. Hit me. Thank you for listening to the Senior Rehab Podcast. The show notes for this episode and much, much more can be found at seniorrehabproject.com. If you found value in this conversation, please share this with one other person that could benefit. And until next time, do not forget to stay funky.